Right, so as we said, we're coming to you live from the G20 convention, and of course the high-octane G20 Summit is underway. Several bilaterals are scheduled for today. The all-important bilateral with the United States President Joe Biden took place yesterday with Prime Minister Modi. It was a 50-minute meeting and much was discussed in that meeting as well. And of course there are key issues that are likely to be discussed in these bilateral meetings and of course at the multilateral forum, including climate action, sustainable development goals, as well as the issues of food and energy security as well. So those are some of the major issues likely to be discussed, along with the revamping of multilateral development banks and of course rehashing the way lending is done to the emerging world, a key issue here. And of course Prime Minister has also promised to be a voice of the global south. We've seen that with the African Union being added to the G20 today as well. And the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi welcomed the leaders at the venue at the summit, the Bharat Mandapam, and a lot is lined up. As we said during this session, there are two sessions that are going to happen in the first half of the day. One session is called One Earth and is expected to be on climate, and the other session is One Family, which will take place later today. As we said, key bilaterals are slated for today as well. One is with the Japanese Prime Minister, the other with the German Chancellor and the Italian Prime Minister as well. And the session meetings have concluded. The Prime Minister, along with the President, will be holding an official dinner tonight for all the leaders. And let's listen in to some of the reactions coming in.
हम सभी की ओर से कुछ देर पहले सबका साथ की भावना से ही भारत ने प्रस्ताव रखा था कि अफ्रीकन यूनियन को G20 की स्थायी सदस्यता दी जाए। मेरा विश्वास है कि इस प्रस्ताव पर हम सबकी सहमति है।
All right, and Siddhant Sibal is joining us live from the G20 convention as well, tracking all the latest developments on the ground. And Siddhant, a lot lined up today, and those important bilaterals with the Japanese side, the German Chancellor and the Italian Prime Minister as well, to begin with.
Well, yes, it will be a packed day for the Indian Prime Minister. In fact, it has been a packed week for the Indian Prime Minister, whether it's the ASEAN Summit level meetings in Jakarta or the G20 Summit meeting here in Delhi, which has started. Now, we know that the Indian Prime Minister had three bilaterals yesterday with the Mauritian leadership, with the Bangladesh leadership and with the US President. Today, as you pointed out, there are several other bilaterals. But all in all, India's focus is to present itself at the heart of global diplomacy and be the bridge when it comes to forming consensus, key consensus at a time of great geopolitical flux, whether it's the issue of the Ukraine conflict, the fallout from the Ukraine conflict in terms of the food, fuel and commodity prices, or in terms of how India can give an imprint to the global governance architecture.
Right, and one of those key promises that Prime Minister Modi made was, of course, adding the African Union to the G20 and making this a much more inclusive group, and that's happened. So that's one success story. And of course, we know that there is consensus building on other issues put forth by the Indian side as well.
Well, African Union's membership was something that the Indian side had taken up with all the G20 member countries, and we saw that moment when the Indian External Affairs Minister was there at that plenary hall, and the Comorosian President, who is the African Union chair, was welcomed by the Indian Prime Minister, and then the African Union's flag put at that high table, the G20 table, where the other leaders were also sitting. But nonetheless, it shows India's priority towards Africa. In fact, during this year's presidency, there is a maximum number of countries of Global South and African countries as well. Many African countries which have been invited by India: Egypt, Nigeria, and of course we know South Africa is a permanent member of this grouping. Also Mauritius and Comoros president, who is present here in Delhi as the chair of the African Union. So all in all, while the West versus Russia goes on and there is a big divide over the Ukraine conflict, India's focus is to bring the voice of the global South at the high table.
Right, Siddhant, stay with us. We have much to talk about, of course, but let me highlight the other big story today. The fact is that the Indian Sherpa, Amitabh Kant, had hinted that the draft resolution for the joint communique was ready, but was open to negotiations and discussions with, of course, other member parties. Now, Reuters is reporting that the 38-page draft resolution is ready, with 75 paragraphs, and one paragraph has been left blank for geopolitics. It means there is that window of disagreement, of course, on the Russia-Ukraine war, and that window of discussion is totally between the West on one side and, of course, Russia and China on the other side. There are all kinds of conversations going on at the moment, sources indicating there might be a dissent note allowed from Russia and China. I don't know if that's a possibility at all. There's also, of course, negotiations going back and forth on this as well, and Chinese and Russians have made it clear that they will not agree to anything that is not in line with their policies as far as the Ukraine war is concerned. The Bali Declaration definitely had 2 paragraphs on the Ukraine-Russia war. That is something at that point Russia and China had agreed to, but they've moved beyond that situation now, and Russia is saying we're not going to agree to anything that sounds like the Bali Declaration as well. So what kind of breakthrough can we look at, at the moment? We don't know. And if there is no joint communique at this G20 Leaders Summit, it would be the first time in 20 years that this would happen. Not a very good moment then. Moreover, Russia is not alone, of course, as I said, in raising those objections. China has joined suit in, talking about the languaging of the joint communique, the war in Ukraine, its implications, the need for a resolution, and the entire fate of this joint communique, of course, rests on the balancing act that India can do. And we've done a pretty good job so far. We've had several outcome documents coming out in the lead up to this, of course, but no joint communique even in those ministerial track level discussions because of the differences which are so clear between these countries. Right, so as we discuss the differences in the joint declaration, there's also India's G20 agenda, which is very important. Now, India has maintained that it wants an inclusive draft, a draft that highlights the issues of the global South and all the countries affected by this food and energy crisis, which means we want the IMF restructuring, we want the banking structure restructuring to happen, we want sustainable goals to be met, we want climate mitigation, as well as, of course, the addition of African Union in the grouping. We've talked at length about the lending process of the World Bank. America has been on board with that, saying that yes, we have asked the Congress for $3.3 billion in addition to helping the World Bank give more money to the emerging world. This is also in a way for America at least to take wean off the influence that China has in the emerging world, which it calls coercive lending as well. So for India, there are many important issues, and I think the messaging with the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is One Earth, One Family, which essentially means that we need to reach sustainable goals and we need to include a large part of the world that has been affected by the Ukraine war coming out of the pandemic. As I said, 30% of this world is in recession, 70% are in some sort of debt, and about 200 million are under the poverty line. These are real figures, and this is what Prime Minister Modi has pushed for. Even in his interview to a newspaper just ahead of the summit, he said we have moved from a GDP-centric G20 to a human-centric G20.
भारत